Changing your opinion on something isn't automatically a bad thing. Stubbornness has a sort of admirable quality to it, since it represents a certain assuredness to your thinking and that you know what you want, but flexibility of thought can be super valuable for not being a dick, basically. The same game can be perceived very differently at varying points of time, and there's no guarantee that any game will be viewed the same in, say, a decade's time with an ever-changing gaming climate and demographic. What I'm trying to say is that everything you love now will eventually become obsolete in the future. Don't worry, try not to think about it. So maybe the hated part of the title is a bit harsh in a lot of cases, since it's more of a fluctuation in popularity than an outright cataclysmic decline or anything, but I do find it interesting how a game gets to that point, if just because I wonder if it couldn't have been avoided. There are a ton of examples out there of games that have stayed pretty much the same through the years, or have ascended to a higher plane of legendary status, so I'm sitting here wondering, like, how the fuck do you do it? How do you ensure that something like 2018's God of War is still loved and cherished in 20 years' time? I don't know, I feel like there's gotta be people who are paid more than I am to work that out. I get paid in disappointing YouTube analytics, what about you? So I imagine I might end up annoying quite a lot of people with this video, since I am implying that a game they may still enjoy is not as popular as it once was, and hey, I get that. If somebody told me that something I loved was not quite as popular as it once was, you know, I would be annoyed, I'd be angry, but also proud for persevering through some pretty dark times. Maybe also concerned that I did not react in the same way as other people. It's fine. It's always interesting to look at the games directly preceding some of the best games of all time, since it helps you to get a sense of what direction that franchise or developer was heading in when they hit it off big with their next title. You've got games like Batman Arkham City and Portal 2 acting as incredible sequels to brilliant games, and then the likes of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild and Silent Hill 2 acting as huge steps up to anything that came before. You've even got standalone debuts like Minecraft and BioShock that hit the ground running from the start and never really looked back. But that second one is interesting because it plays into the idea of an unbelievably good game overshadowing another almost as great game. And when this happens, you start getting people saying that the previous game was never good. And damn, because GTA 4 did a lot of important things. Like many other franchises, the most important Grand Theft Auto game is the one where it made the leap into 3D and didn't tumble headfirst into a bush full of thorns, and that makes Grand Theft Auto 3 this protected child who can do no wrong. Meanwhile, you got GTA 5, which is this must-play, next-gen experience that's gonna blow your fucking brain out, be so incredible and amazing, you must play it, otherwise you will crumble into dust. The problem is, it doesn't leave much room for the fourth game now, does it? But rather than Grand Theft Auto 4 being hated or simply not loved as much as other games for being the weird middle child in the family, there's a more straightforward reason why opinion on this game has changed so much. GTA 3 does try to replicate a realistic city, but does so with an enjoyably arcade-like approach, where stupid things happen on the regular and everything explodes. GTA 5 goes for something very similar and is acutely aware of what kind of people play this game and what they're most interested in. It kind of plays into the usual GTA archetype, and that helped to make it a ridiculous success. That just leaves 4, which is a lot more serious and deliberately realistic as a means of showing off the fancy new tech that Rockstar were working with, and it's all very brown. It is so brown. It leaves Grand Theft Auto 4 in this weird niche where it's clearly the bleakest, most story-driven game in the franchise, but that's not really why people play these games. It's an interesting game to look at and think about and to dissect afterwards, but it's not as fun to play as 3 and 5 and really any of the others. It's a tricky proposition because GTA 4 falls down because of how out of place it is within its own franchise, but if GTA 5 had gone for a similar aesthetic, then I'd worry how 4 would stack up alongside it. I don't think it would have helped. It's still kind of fun though, just not the game of choice anymore for a lot of people. But shit, if you want to go bowling, it is overqualified for that. It's It's that time again, like in every video, where I say, hey, I have made this video before in the past, and that is kind of true, but also not. That there is a decent amount of overlap between games that don't really age all that well, and also games that people used to like, but nowadays not so much. And, you know, few games out there are genuinely future-proof, but sometimes, yikes. It can be very hard going back to a game from your childhood and realizing that it's nowhere near as good as you remember it being. Much like looking back on childhood in general reminds me that, hey, school was kind of dumb and everyone called me Willy, and that really got to me. So I didn't grow up with Sonic Adventure since I didn't have the right consoles to play it, and I preferred my protagonist silent and with non-detachable jaws, but I can appreciate how important this game was for Sega, the Sonic franchise, and the people who played it, and can draw so many wonderful memories from it. I'm saying this now before I shit all over it because I can accept that Sonic Adventure was at the forefront of cutting-edge video game excellence once upon a time. Nowadays though, it's definitely something alright. But despite the glitches and poor level design and voice acting and Big the Cat stumbling around looking for something to do, and many other little problems that litter this game and drag it down to a level reserved for games that don't age well, I still get a lot out of Sonic Adventure. Not for the intended reasons, mind you, but I think it's important a game is entertaining above anything else, and I can confirm that shit like this is endlessly entertaining. Unfortunately, not everyone these days can get as much as I can out of this game, and if you're after some legitimately good Sonic gameplay and a story that makes sense and characters who don't look like they're melting every time they try to say words, you probably won't find it here. Instead, you might find some guy shilling himself out on the internet and trying to convince people to subscribe to his YouTube channel and ring bells or whatever. It is a curious period of Sonic's history though, where it was initially loved for what it was as a proof of concept, but it's since been surpassed into the earth by future titles, even with Sonic's checkered history with 3D games. In a certain mood, I feel like this is very easy to hate. I just try not to. Overexposure is not a fun thing to be a part of. It's ultimately the tipping point that helps move a current trend along and into the graveyard in favour of something else new and exciting that we can lose our goddamn minds over until it's everywhere and we pray for some much needed variety in our lives once again. There is such a thing as too popular, and with the internet becoming this gloriously out of control hive of activity that promotes a game from obscurity into oh god make it stop in a matter of days, there's been a lot of games that have gotten too popular too quickly. One of the most egregious cases that helped to spawn a whole wave of games that rode off the initial huge wave of momentum was Five Nights at Freddy's, a game that needs no introduction because it was hugely popular 5 years ago, and 8 games later, I wish for death. And that's a damn shame, because the first FNAF game existing in a vacuum with no ties to Rush sequels or every over-exaggerating Let's Player under the sun, this is a really good fucking game, guys! It's a bit of a landmark for first-person horror really, because there weren't and still aren't a ton of games out there that create fear by moving a scary world around the player instead of the other way around. It creates this fascinating ambience where you literally can't run away or hide from the terrors of this pizzeria you find yourself in, and I found that when I played it, I kinda just got on with things out of fear of being exposed to one of the game's many jump scares. You haven't really got time to process what's going on, it just comes at you very quickly, and you gotta adapt, otherwise you're gonna get scared. The problem is that future games after, like, the third one, lent heavily on gimmicks and those pesky jump scares, to the point where they didn't even try to replicate or surpass the atmosphere that was so terrifying in the first one. Obviously, if you're a keen fan and obsess over the lore to a level that even game theory would blush at, you've been eating up all of the games that came after, and are currently listening to this video with your VR headset on in between nights of the latest release in a franchise that sadly shows no sign of slowing down and making improvements. I wish it would, because I genuinely love that first one, and it currently represents the start of a series of games that spiraled out of control in record time. At least lots of people made lots of money. I feel like I should be transparent with the fact that this video was heavily inspired by the recent and sudden shift in how a lot of people feel about Pokemon Sword and Shield. It's a cycle we should all be used to at this point, where a new Pokemon game is announced, some adorable new critters are shown off alongside too much information about all the innovative features of this new region, and then we all have cold water poured on us either before or after release, and something rocks the boat which then gives the public a reason or two to doubt how good the latest Pokemon game is. I'm not saying that Sword and Shield will suddenly turn into Game of the Year contenders come November, but we have been there before with virtually every game before this, and hey, it usually works out okay in the end. Until subsequent games make so many improvements that the originals seem archaic and cumbersome by comparison and kinda like bad games? I mean, yeah? The original generation of Pokemon is one of the OG craze games, where Pokemania swept many nations, and then you had games, followed by card games, and then a TV show, like an anime, and there's a film in there somewhere, and suddenly, FNAF seems quite tame by comparison. And with all this media in such a short space of time, it's safe to say that a lot of people really liked Gen 1 of Pokemon. And then it got a hell of a lot better. Which is where I think nostalgia gets in the way a lot, because while it can insulate a whole load of old memories from the harsh, brutal ravages of time, it can also be blinding to the many shortcomings of the first gen of Pokemon. These games are kind of terrible and riddled with horrible design decisions that render them close to unplayable at times, since it lacks the balancing and refinement of the games that came after. However, while Pokemon Red, Blue, and kind of Green, I guess, have aged about as well as milk, the one aspect that was designed pretty nicely was the Pokemon themselves, something that was picked up by merchandise and TV shows and obviously new games that helped propel the franchise forward. Am I suggesting that Pokemon wouldn't be anywhere near as popular as it is these days if it was just an army of humans that you were trying to recruit instead of a bunch of creatures? Yeah, I think I am, since I really liked Snorlax growing up and I probably wouldn't have liked a lazy fat man who blocks roads for a living. Either way, now we have a large selection of other more polished Pokemon games that also feature the original 151 Pokemon. The first generation only really serves as an important jumping off point without which we wouldn't have any of this. Just look at it this way, the worst Pokemon game is the first batch, which is exactly how every franchise should be doing things. Will Sword and Shield be the best? I'll come back to you on that one. There's a pattern emerging among the games I've talked about before this point, primarily that they're all one-time releases. You put a game out there into the world, people feel a certain way about it at release, and over time this feeling either fluctuates or stays consistent. This changes a lot when you're dealing with online games or anything that gets new patches and updates fairly frequently, since you're dealing with what may well be a very large player base and how they react to alterations made to the game. Balancing an online shooter is a very difficult task when you're adding new things all the time, but when you've already got a volatile community that has a history of toxic behavior, you're walking on eggshells. I still enjoy Overwatch from time to time. It's a pretty fun game with a guy who skates along vertical walls, so keeping myself entertained is not the problem here. When Overwatch first came out, it was exactly what I and many others needed after the decline of Team Fortress 2, with its vibrant cast of characters and similarly wild approach to objective-based gameplay. I remember when it was first released, I said that this is the game to either replace TF2 or to get the best out of it, which is a really interesting quote 3 years down the line, now we know better. I mean, Team Fortress 2 isn't doing amazingly these days or anything, but to be fair, it has been out for 12 years at this point. Overwatch doesn't really have that excuse. Explaining why Overwatch is currently at its lowest ebb is a little complicated, but I think you can trace most of it back to ill-conceived additions to a mostly very well-balanced game. Overwatch was already likely to add characters, but most of them are designed as very specific hard counters to others, which I imagine works well for game balance until these new characters are stupidly broken on their own, but it's a means of fixing the game by breaking everything else and ruining the fun that people were having playing as characters like Genji and Tracer, who are now borderline unusable. And of course it's unbalanced, there's more than 30 of them now. That is a huge undertaking for any studio. The number of characters now that exist solely to disrupt and displace enemies is really depressing, and when you stack this onto a game that is still struggling with toxicity and a community that is becoming smaller by the day, you wonder how long Overwatch has left. If it lasts as long as Team Fortress 2 has, Jeff Kaplan deserves a promotion to godhood. This is RabbidLuigi, and the single bit of gossip that I was most intrigued by before E3 rolled around again this year were rumours of Overwatch 2. Now, obviously we didn't get anything because BlizzCon is in November, and that's kind of what Blizzard uses to announce all their interesting shit, but I feel like a sequel to Overwatch that changes a lot of things and doesn't really try to fix much does feel like admitting defeat. You know, we're not gonna actually try and fix what's broken. We're just gonna burn it down. And hopefully leave Hanzo behind. Have you got a topic that you'd like me to talk about next week? Make sure you leave a comment about that down below because I'll be taking the most interesting suggestions and making a poll on the next video. In fact, here's one right now that I prepared from last week. I'll be revealing the winner of the poll on Twitter and taking suggestions for games to talk about that are related to that topic. So feel free to follow me over there so we can keep in touch. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.